Okay, our first speakers today are going to be Samantha Inokian and Laura Rakoljuk from USCIS. Laura Rakoljuk maintains a civil surgeon portfolio for the USCIS Office of Policy and Strategy located at USCIS headquarters. She's worked in the field of immigration since 2003 when she joined the Immigration and Naturalization Service as an immigration inspector. She transitioned to USCIS in 2008 at the New York District Office and has also served in USCIS offices in Connecticut, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Also joining us from USCIS is Samantha Inokian, who graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park, with a BA in Russian language and literature. She now works as a policy analyst in the Policy Development Coordination Division in the Office of Policy and Strategy, facilitating the policy publication process. Samantha also works on the development of USCIS Civil Surgeon Program and is excited to participate in her first all-virtual civil surgeon event. A little bit later, we'll hear from Dr. Kimberly Skrobarchuk from CDC and Dr. John Bernardo at the Massachusetts Department.
Okay, and we will pass it over to our first presenters, Laura and Sam. Hi, Laura and Sam. Are you guys able to unmute?
Hi, Olivia. I'm here.
Okay. Yes, we'll pass it over to you guys now to start for our first presentation.
Laura, are you able to unmute? Well, it looks like.
Hi, Laura. I unmuted you. Are you able to hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah,
okay,
I'm
great.
sorry about that. My computer,
okay.
the mute button is frozen. Hopefully that doesn't continue. Anyways, hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. We're really excited to be here with you today. My name is Laura Rakoljuk, and we are excited to kick off this webinar series by taking a look at the Form I-693, Report of Medical Examination and Vaccination Record, and the USCIS aspect of this process. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules, especially so early in the morning. Probably most of us are on the East Coast where it's early enough, but I've heard that some of you may be joining us from all over the country, so we really do appreciate it. Whether you've been a civil surgeon for years or you are just considering applying to join us, we hope that you learned something today. And I also want to welcome to all of you who are part of this process in other ways. I know we have some folks joining us from, of course, the health departments as well as the USCIS. There's a lot going on right now for all of us, and we hope that you're keeping safe and healthy. Sam and I really do miss being able to present to you all in person. But for now, we are glad to be able to connect in this manner. With that, I will turn it over to Sam, and she can say hi and then start us off.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. My name is Sam. I work with Laura. I just wanted to say before we get started, thank you so much to the folks who helped organize this, and we are very excited to be able to get back into the swing of doing these presentations again. We have certainly missed it, and of course we wish we were there in person, but we're glad to have this virtual environment to sort of interact with you all, and we're excited about this. So thank you so much for attending. So we will go ahead and get started. Just some reminders about
Sam, I'm sorry.
Oh, hi, Laura.
Just to interrupt one quick, I'm so sorry. Olivia, I am not able to see the slides if you are showing them right now. I'm going to go ahead and quickly disconnect. Perhaps Sam can start off with the slides, and then I'll join back in and see if it works.
Okay, great. No problem.
Sorry about that.
It would not be a good virtual event without some technical difficulties, of course. All right, everyone. So just to jump right in, a few disclaimers and reminders to get out of the way before we get into the content of the presentation. We do have to let you know the presentation is only valid as of the date of the last revision. As you know, things are constantly changing and evolving in this world, so we try and update it as frequently as possible. So in this case, the presentation was last updated on the 30th of October. We also wanted to remind you that this presentation is for informational purposes only, and we use it for training. All right, and then we wanted to go over the course objectives. So we have 4 main objectives for today. First is to understand the purpose of, understand the purpose of civil surgeons and the importance of immigration medical examinations in the adjustment of status context. Second is to familiarize civil surgeons, so you all, with the role of USCIS, CDC, the local health departments, and then the role of civil surgeons and what we expect from you all. We also want to remind civil surgeons of your responsibilities. And then we want to better ensure that you all feel comfortable and are able to properly complete the Form I-693, also referred to as the Report of Medical Examination and Vaccination Record. So to achieve those objectives, we have outlined the day as follows. So we'll go over an immigration law summary. We'll talk about lawful permanent resident status, as well as some of the health-related grounds of inadmissibility. We'll run through the immigration medical examination, and then we'll go over some key roles. So we'll discuss the CDC, health departments, USCIS, and then civil surgeons. We'll then move on to discussing the civil surgeon designation, talking about the requirements and the application process, some of the responsibilities, and the revocation process. We'll then move to discussing how to complete the Form I-693. We'll talk about common Form I-693 errors and how to avoid those, and then we'll go over a few frequently asked questions. And then we'll just wrap it up with a summary and then go over some of our legal authorities and a few resources. All right. Let's see, it does not look like Laura was able to join back in.
I am on.
Sam. Oh, you are here.
The audio,
wonderful.
Just not the, so if you can just go through the slides for me, that'd be great. And we can,
I will.
We can keep.
Great, so I will pass the mic to Laura.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, folks, we'll start with a brief immigration 101 of sorts. So here you see a sample lawful permanent resident or green card. You'll also hear the abbreviation LPR. We use that a lot for these folks. So these are the non-citizens who are authorized to live and work in the United States permanently. And they can qualify for this through various means, including through close family members, through work, by qualifying for status as a refugee or asylum seeker. And then finally, the last one we have listed here is the famed diversity visa, which is often referred to as the green card lottery. Okay, the 2 processes to becoming an LPR are separated out on the chart before you. On the left side is what we call consular processing. This is where the person applies for an immigrant visa at the U.S. at a U.S. consular post abroad, and note that their examination is conducted by a panel physician. And then on the right, we have the adjustment of status process inside the United States. And that involves filing the Form I-485, and this is where you, the civil surgeons, would conduct the immigration medical examination. So these people, the adjustment of status folks, they've made their way into the U.S. in a variety of different manners, and they're now seeking a permanent way to remain. Okay, admissibility. So being found admissible basically means that you're legally allowed to enter or in the case of adjustment of status applicants, you're allowed to remain in the U.S. So, for example, you could enter on a non-immigrant visa lawfully and then be in the U.S. and then later on be found inadmissible when applying for a green card based on a variety of things such as criminal acts. So basically, in a nutshell, those applying for adjustment of status, even though they're already physically present in the U.S., are still considered to be seeking admission to the U.S. Our immigration laws specify certain acts and conditions and conduct that bar applicants from being found admissible. There are many grounds of inadmissibility, and they are listed in the Immigration and Nationality Act, or INA, Section 212. Examples are criminal grounds, national security, public charge, past immigration law violations, and the topic of this presentation, health-related grounds of inadmissibility. Generally, waivers are available for individuals subject to the grounds of health-related inadmissibility. Only USCIS may grant that waiver, but we will typically confer with CDC for those waivers. Okay, specifically as to the health-related grounds of inadmissibility, there are 4 basic categories that make an applicant inadmissible. The first is having a communicable disease of public health significance. Another is failure to show proof of having received required vaccinations against vaccine-preventable diseases. And then we have physical and mental disorders with associated harmful behavior. And finally, drug abusers and addicts as set forth in the HHS regulations. The basis of the immigration medical exam involves diagnosing a Class A or Class B medical condition. The applicable law here is the INA Section 212A1. Diagnosis of a Class A condition, such as active TB or syphilis, automatically makes the applicant inadmissible. And any physical or mental disorder with associated harmful behavior or drug abuse and addiction could also qualify as a Class A. And you should note that USCIS does accept the civil surgeon's diagnosis as conclusive. Okay, moving on to Class Bs. A Class B condition is defined as a physical or mental condition, disease, or disability which is serious in degree or permanent in nature. Some examples include latent TB, diabetes, or HIV. The applicant is not inadmissible based on a Class B diagnosis, but it may impact other grounds of inadmissibility, specifically when considering whether the person might be able to support themselves financially. Okay, and back over to Sam to start the next section.
All right, now we're going to transition into talking about the actual immigration medical examination. So first, we just wanted to go over some who, why, and what. So who needs the exam? For an easy reference point, you all can check out this chart, and this is found in the USCIS Policy Manual, Volume 8, Part B, Chapter 3, which is linked here. And you can also use the FAQ section of the I-693 instructions. So, for example, you could check out that section or this chart and say, okay, I have an adjustment applicant. Yes, they would need a medical examination. Yes, they would need a vaccination, and it would be conducted by a civil surgeon. As we mentioned earlier, as a civil surgeon, you all are seeing folks who are already in the U.S. applying through USCIS for adjustment of status. So transitioning to the why of this, why are we doing this? The purpose of the immigration medical examination is to diagnose any medical condition which would make the applicant inadmissible and thus not eligible for adjustment of status, unless, of course, they qualified for a waiver. So basically, you all are determining whether someone poses a public health risk, and then USCIS will make a determination about the admissibility of the applicant based on that finding. The medical exam is based on the CDC's technical instructions, or TIs, which are publicly available on the CDC's website, and we will discuss a little bit later. All right, so what is taking place in this exam? So first, we're asking you all to conduct a review of the applicant's medical history, and then a review of any other records available to you all as a physician. We like to remind you to remember to review hospitalizations, institutionalizations for chronic conditions, illnesses or disabilities, psychoactive drug and alcohol use, and chest x-ray treatment records if the applicant has a history indicative of tuberculosis. You all will then conduct a review of systems to determine the presence and severity of any Class A or Class B conditions. And then, of course, the physical examination, including an evaluation of mental status and all of those relevant diagnostic tests. So specifically, you can ask about symptoms that suggest cardiovascular, pulmonary, musculoskeletal, and/or neuropsychiatric disorders. And of course, that's just a brief overview, and we'll look at some of the specific sections of the exam when we cover the 693 form in just a little bit. All right, so we have the who, what, and why, and now we have our other key players. So we have the CDC. The role of the CDC is of course, they have several roles in this process. The one you might be most familiar with is that the CDC writes the federal regulations that define the health-related conditions of inadmissibility, and they publish the TIs, or technical instructions, which prescribe the requirements for immigration medical examinations. The TIs are binding on all parties involved, so that includes panel physicians, civil surgeons, and immigration officers, and they have the force of regulations. Those are all available on the CDC's website. If an applicant seeks a waiver of a health-related inadmissibility, USCIS will consult with the CDC about eligibility for the waiver application. And then finally, the CDC is available to answer questions from civil surgeons as well as panel physicians based on the technical instructions. I think we also know about the role of the health departments, and the role that they play is key in tuberculosis control. So our health departments also work especially with refugees who are eligible for benefits from Health and Human Services, also referred to as HHS. And we did want to note that those HHS benefits processes are separate from DHS and USCIS. And then also our health department physicians are able to serve as civil surgeons, but solely for the purposes of providing the vaccination record on the form for refugees. And these are called blanket civil surgeons. I also see that we do have a question in the chat, and I wanted to acknowledge that. We will, I think we could get to that at the end of the presentation. It'll probably be easier if we do it that way. Right, and then USCIS, so this is Sam and Laura, obviously not just the two of us, but USCIS adjudicates the Form I-485, so based on the results shown in the Form I-693, USCIS will determine if the applicant is admissible or inadmissible on health-related grounds. As you all are probably aware, a Class A condition would indicate inadmissibility, and if there's no Class A condition, it would indicate that they are admissible, and USCIS will deny the Form I-485 if the applicant has a Class A condition or is otherwise inadmissible and that inadmissibility is not waived. USCIS will usually approve of an I-485 if an applicant is not inadmissible and is otherwise legally eligible for adjustment of status. So I think it's very important to note that USCIS is bound by a civil surgeon's medical findings. USCIS also adjudicates the Form I-910, so that's the application that you all used. So that's how physicians apply to become designated as a civil surgeon. And just a note, prior to 2014, local USAS offices would designate civil surgeons in their jurisdiction. However, as of March 11th of 2014, the designation process was centralized, and the I-910 form is now filed with the USAS National Benefit Center, sometimes referred to as the NBC. And currently we have over 5,000 designated civil surgeons throughout the U.S., so kudos to you all. And we also wanted to go over the role of the civil surgeons. So first, you all followed the technical instructions from the CDC. You truthfully and accurately report medical examination records on the form I-693. That's the report of medical examination and vaccination record. You also will notify USCIS of any revocation or restriction of medical license. And that's actually, it's important to note that that's an obligation. So you're obligated to inform us of any license restriction or revocation. And then you'll notify USCIS within 15 days of any change in office location or other contact information. All right, so now we will talk a little bit more about the actual civil surgeon designation, and I'll pass it back to Laura.
Hey, Sam, thanks. And I am back on for now, so fingers crossed, it keeps going well. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the requirements for being a civil surgeon. What do you need to become a civil surgeon? Only MDs or doctors of osteopathic medicine are eligible, provided that they are licensed without any practice restrictions in the state where the exams will be performed. They need 4 years of professional experience, and residency does not count. And then lastly, you must be authorized to work in the United States. So here you can see Form I-910, the application for civil surgeon designation. We recently published a new edition. I want to also note here something that Sam talked about earlier, the blanket designation to health departments as well as military physicians. So for those folks that qualify in that manner, they do not need to go through the formal application process for Form I-910, but there are specific guidelines around that. So for the health departments, that would be they would be able to do the vaccination portion for refugees adjusting status only, because the refugees already got the exam overseas, so that's why we're able to do with the vaccination portion later on for the adjustment process. And then for the military physicians, they can actually complete the entire exam, but it is for eligible military personnel and their immediate families, as long as it's conducted in a military treatment facility. If you want to find out more about that, please visit our policy manual, and you can see the link there, Volume 8, Part C, Chapter 3. One more note about this form. It's been around since 2014. As we mentioned before, the designation process became centralized in 2014. Prior to that, we designated civil surgeons in the district offices, and each office handled that process themselves without a form application. Okay, so I want to just talk briefly about revocation. We do outline procedures for revocation in our policy manual, and you can see the link there. That's Volume 8, Part C, Chapter 4. If a civil surgeon is revoked, their name will be removed from the public list, and they cannot perform examinations until reinstated. And if for some reason the exams are performed anyways, either the civil surgeon was not aware of their revocation or they chose to ignore it, the applicant would then be forced to return to a different civil surgeon to conduct another exam. The designation status needs to be valid on the date of the exam. Okay, so why would this happen? Get the next slide, please. So there are many reasons that we may revoke according to the policy manual. There's one that's actually not listed here, and I'll talk about it first because it's by far the most common reason we see this. So it's a civil surgeon's responsibility to ensure that their contact information is updated and that you can always receive mail at your main practice location. The NBC, the National Benefit Center that Sam mentioned earlier, conducts biannual reviews of their civil surgeon records. And they do this by sending notification by mail to civil surgeons and requesting updates. If you receive this and don't respond, they may send you a notice of intent to revoke, and that's the first step in the revocation process. If you still don't respond, then they will revoke your designation. So it's really important that you keep that information current. I'm sure that a lot of you are probably familiar with this by now because they have been sending these out quite a bit lately. So please take those seriously and complete them in a timely manner. And then just moving on to the other reasons we have listed, failure to comply with the technical instructions or the form instructions consistently or intentionally, falsifying or concealing any material facts in the Form I-910, also falsifying and concealing information on the I-693, being subject to any court or disciplinary action that revokes, suspends, or otherwise restricts your authority to practice as a physician, and failing to meet any of the professional qualifications for a civil surgeon. Okay, moving along, we're going to take a look now at completing the Form I-693. So here you can see our website for the form. We released the most recent version on 7/15/2019, and it will expire in 2022. USCIS only accepts this version. You can always find the most recent version here on the website. Also, there's instructions there, there's helpful links, etc. So the first two sections I'm going to go over here are in the applicant's portion of the form, but we'll show you as we do get a lot of questions from civil surgeons on these. So part 3 is the interpreter. This interpreter can be an official interpreter. It can be a member of your office staff or someone accompanying the applicant. And then if none of these is available, you can use a remote or telephonic interpreter as well. And then next we have the preparer section, part 4. It's the final part of the applicant's portion of the form. And the civil surgeon or a member of their staff would not need to complete this section unless they completed the entire applicant's portion of the form. So we understand that obviously the civil surgeon is completing the rest of the form. They're preparing the rest of the form, but that is not the same as completing the applicant's portion. Okay, part 5, verifying identity, applicant's identification information. So if the person is lacking an unexpired ID, we will look at that later towards the end of our presentation about what you can do. But basically, the technical instructions and the form instructions do require the civil surgeon to make every reasonable effort to verify that the person examined and tested is in fact the person identified in the Form I-693. Okay, we're going to move on to part 8 now. The civil surgeon worksheet. This question comes up frequently following the release of the most recent form. In the TB section, if an applicant has a positive quantiferin but a normal chest X-ray, how should the classification and findings portion be completed? So applicants with a positive AGRA but no signs or symptoms of TB, a normal chest X-ray, and no known HIV must receive a Class B2 TB LTBI evaluation. And this can be documented as Class B latent TB infection on this form.
All right, now we're going to talk about Part 9. This is the referral evaluation. I also wanted to mention, I see a lot of questions in the chat about the interpreter and signature, and we will get to that at the end. We'll do a frequently asked questions portion, and that will be addressed. So I promise we see your questions, and many of them already have answers coming. So civil surgeon must refer applicants when it's required under the technical instructions. Some examples of necessary referrals include active tuberculosis cases referred to the health department, or if the civil surgeon feels the applicant needs to see a specialist for a psychiatric evaluation. And the report of any consulting physician as received by you, the civil surgeon, will need to be included with the Form I-693. And the civil surgeon remains responsible for completing and personally signing the 693 form. So Part 10, the vaccination record. All applicants applying for adjustment of status must show proof that they have received the vaccinations required for the immigration medical examination and for immigration purposes. So some vaccinations are specifically required in the INA, while others are determined by the CDC. And you can tell what vaccinations are required by the CDC on their by their immunization schedules, and we've provided a link to the CDC website here, and it will be given to you all after. So we wanted to go over this specifically. This is where the civil surgeon must complete Part 10 to indicate the results of the vaccination record. So for this example, we have the applicant meeting all of the requirements. However, whatever the case may be, please remember to always complete Part 10 by checking the results box. As with most of the common errors we see, it's simple and easy to fix, but please, please, please don't forget to actually check out that box. Once again, in Part 6, the summary of medical examination, please remember to ensure it's complete by either marking A, B, or C in the summary of overall findings. This is a fairly common error when a civil surgeon forgets to mark that there was no Class A or Class B condition. So please just remember to check either A, B, or C here so that the form is complete. Moving on to Part 7, this is the civil surgeon certification. So before signing and dating the form in Part 7, please ensure all follow-up evaluations and treatments are completed. Ensure that all finding and results boxes are completed for each section. Ensure Part 6, that summary of medical examination, is completed. And ensure that the applicant has signed and dated the form in your presence. So when everything has been completed, it's very important to remember to sign. And I know it looks like we're going overboard, but it's a very common error and a very easy one to fix. So we have this handy visual which shows you exactly where you, the civil surgeon, should sign. So not below it, not above it, but right in that box. And just as a reminder, you all, as the civil surgeon, must actually physically sign the form. And this does not mean that your office manager can stamp it or sign for you. It has to be you, the civil surgeon. Part 7. So this is the civil surgeon's contact information, certification, and signature. We wanted to remind you all that there are some unique validity rules for the 693 form. So the form is valid for 2 years from the date of the civil surgeon's signature. The date of the signature must be no earlier than 60 days before the underlying Form I-485, that's the adjustment of status application, was filed. However, applicants may still submit the Form I-693 after the 485 filing. And again, all of this is on our website, so if you ever forget, it's all there. All right, so completing the form, this slide just summarizes the 693 instructions for placing the form in a sealed envelope and what to write on the front and back of that envelope. So you're going to place the form and any supporting documents, those referrals, into the envelope, seal it up, and on the front of the envelope, in all capital letters, you'll write "Do not open for USCIS only." And then on the back of the envelope, across the seal, you'll write your initials. Again, that's where the flap and the envelope meet, just to ensure that it hasn't been opened before it reaches the National Benefit Center. Or sorry, not the National Benefit Center, but before it reaches USCIS. And again, please remind your patients not to open that envelope because an unsealed envelope will not be accepted. All right, so more reminders about submitting the 693. Please give the sealed envelope with the signed and completed exam to the applicant, and then they will give it to USCIS. It's also important to remember to give the applicant a copy of the completed form and remind them not to open the sealed envelope. This just helps with transparency. All right, so in sum, I know the text is small, but basically the process goes like this. So the applicant prepares the form I-485, then they make an appointment with a civil surgeon to attend their medical examination. The civil surgeon will complete the examination following the CDC's technical instructions, and then they will give the form to the patient. The patient will give it to USCIS with the adjustment of status application, and then they will file for adjustment. USCIS will adjudicate the adjustment of status application. If the applicant is admissible or otherwise eligible for adjustment, the green card will be issued. If there's issues with the 693 form, USCIS will send a letter to the applicant requesting the applicant submit additional evidence, and then it will go sort of back into the flow chart here. Again, lots of good questions, and we will get to them in the FAQ portion of the slides, and then address some of these other ones. So Laura is now going to go over some common errors.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so next we've included a section about what not to do, basically, highlighting some common errors that we see. So one we see a lot is having I-693 submissions on an outdated form. This happens a lot, you know, when we're close to the cutoff dates when we publish a new form. The applicant must submit the exam on the current form. And so for this reason, we recommend that in your office, you don't print out large amounts of forms ahead of time and stockpiling them. You can always find the current version on the I-693 website. Okay, next we have this scenario where an applicant can't speak English or understand English at the interview, and yet the interpreter section was not completed. So this is a fairly common error because many civil surgeons serve their local communities and may speak the foreign language that is spoken by the applicant, kind of thus making an official interpreter or translator for the exam unnecessary. However, it's still important for the civil surgeon in this scenario to complete the interpreter section in part 3 because they are translating the form for the applicant. So, for example, if you speak Spanish as a civil surgeon and your applicant is speaking Spanish, we know that the exam would be taking place in Spanish. But go ahead and still complete that form. I'm sorry, that part of the form. Okay, so applicants 14 and older must sign the form I-693. We often see parents signing for their children, you know, they may be 16, 17 years old. But for USCIS purposes, we want the children to sign at age 14 and older. And of course, the exception that a legal guardian could sign on behalf of someone who is unable to do so themselves. Please only submit one I-693 per envelope. We sometimes see this where an entire family group may be placed into one envelope, and while it might be nice to kind of keep them all together to not lose things, we do need each of those in their own envelope. Okay, we often see errors in the completion of the vaccination section, and we get a lot of questions about this. If an applicant refuses, for example, the flu vaccine for a personal reason, even though it's age appropriate and not contraindicated and it's during flu season, the results box have to be completed as either the applicant will request a waiver, an individual waiver, or the applicant does not meet immunization requirements. So you have to question the applicant as to why they do not want to get the flu vaccine. And if they indicate it's for religious or moral grounds, then you can indicate that they will request a waiver. If not, then it's pretty straightforward, unfortunately, that they don't meet the immunization requirements. So the most common by far is that we see a lot of I-693s where the civil surgeon simply forgets to sign. So as Sam went over earlier, the signature should be original, must be original. And please only sign after all aspects of the exam, including the return of referrals. And then please don't forget to date as well. Okay, back to Sam to begin the FAQs.
All right. So arguably this is the most useful portion of the presentation here. So the first question we get a lot is, my office has recently expanded our use of telemedicine. Can I conduct the immigration medical exam in this manner? So the answer is no. The CDC has indicated that a medical examination via telemedicine does not currently satisfy the technical instructions requirements, so the exams must still be conducted in person. All right. Are civil surgeons required to give a copy of the completed I-693 form to the applicants? Yes. The instructions for the form direct civil surgeons to provide a copy of the completed original form in a sealed envelope as well as a separate photocopy of the form. The language here is a bit confusing, but you should be giving the original copy in that sealed envelope with the envelope instructions and your initials across the seal, and then a copy to the applicant so that they can sort of see all of your remarks and have full transparency. Okay, so I saw a lot of questions about this, and we get this a lot. So some patients do not have an unexpired government-issued photo ID to prove identity. What documents are acceptable? So according to the 693 instructions, you all as civil surgeons must make every reasonable effort to verify the individual appearing for the exam is the individual applying for the immigration benefit. So of course, the preferred form of ID is a current government-issued ID with a photograph. Absent this, we advise you all to just use your best judgment in accepting any other documentation or form of ID. And if you have any questions, we recommend you include a photocopy of the ID document accepted and a brief narrative explaining the circumstances. And then ultimately USCIS will address and resolve any potential identity issues as part of the adjudication of the adjustment of status applicant. Or application, sorry. We also have patients or applicants who tell us that their name is different than what is shown on their photo ID. How should we handle this situation? So someone's name could change due to marriage or divorce or foreign naming conventions, whatever the case might be. So provided that the photo ID matches the applicant and you believe the person you're seeing is the person applying for adjustment of status, A civil surgeon can accept it and record the name as requested. And then again, just provide a photocopy of the ID documents in a sealed envelope and annotate in Part 11, the additional information section, why the name differs from the ID document. Okay. The applicant or patient does not speak English and could not provide an interpreter. However, my office was able to locate an off-site interpreter. How do we handle completion of this portion of the form? So the telephonic or virtual interpreter completes the interpreter section of the form to include a signature and either faxes or emails that to the civil surgeon to be attached to the original form. And again, in that Part 11, the civil surgeon can annotate why this was done and that the interpretation was done telephonically or virtually. So I know some folks had asked that question earlier, so this should answer it. Yes, the telephonic interpreter still has to sign. It can just be done via fax or email. All right, and then who needs to complete the preparer section? That's Part 4 on the Form I-693. Should I fill it out as the civil surgeon? So a civil surgeon or member of their staff is only required to complete this section if they actually completed the applicant's portion of the form. So if you're simply transcribing or transferring the information, that would not qualify you, the civil surgeon, or whomever as the preparer. All right, I'll pass it back to Laura to talk about blanket designation.
Thanks, Sam. So what is the responsibility of a health department physician acting as a civil surgeon under the blanket designation? And the answer is that these blanket designated civil surgeons, they only perform the vaccination assessment and only for a refugee who is applying for adjustment of status under INA Section 209. And have completed an immigration medical examination overseas with a panel physician. And that this individual must also not be required to repeat any part of the exam. So basically no Class A conditions were found overseas. Okay, next, how much information should civil surgeons provide in describing Class B conditions on Form I-693? And that's in Part 8, Section 4. So we kind of see a wide variety on our 693s that we receive. Some civil surgeons go into great detail and some write almost nothing. But basically, this section is used to list details of an applicant's Class B conditions. So that can be diabetes, hypertension, HIV, for some examples. Civil surgeons should note here any other physical or mental health conditions, diseases, or disabilities that are serious in degree or permanent in nature, and they represent a substantial departure from normal health or well-being. Information should include the diagnosis, manageability, and treatment, and how it is likely to adversely affect the applicant's day-to-day life, or otherwise may require extensive medical care. When assessing the vaccinations a patient or applicant has received, should the civil surgeon accept vaccinations administered abroad? So yes, according to the vaccination TIs, most vaccines used worldwide are from reliable local or international manufacturers. However, the civil surgeon should ensure that such vaccines were administered according to ACIP recommended vaccine schedules. So civil surgeons should basically use their best professional judgment to determine if documentation of prior immunizations is valid. Okay, we talked a little bit about this before, but just to reiterate, if the patient has refused the flu vaccine, even though it is within flu season, how do I annotate this correctly? So you need to inquire as to the reason for the refusal. If the applicant does indicate that it's based on religious or moral convictions, you can check the applicant will request an individual waiver based on religious or moral convictions. And that box is located in the results section. So the applicant is responsible for filing the separate waiver with USCIS. That is not your responsibility. And then if they indicate that that's not the reason they don't want to get the flu vaccine, then you can check applicant does not meet immunization requirements. Okay, can the civil surgeon sign Form I-693 if the applicant is undergoing the required TB treatment? Of course, the answer is no. Civil surgeons should not sign Form I-693 until all follow-up evaluations and required treatments are completed. So if the applicant is undergoing the required treatment, the health department should sign Part 9 once the treatment is completed and the applicant is no longer infectious. The applicant will then return the form to the civil surgeon, and if other parts of the medical exam are now out of date, they may need to be repeated. And then once all parts of the form reflect the applicant's current state of health, then the civil surgeon should sign. Okay, who can civil surgeons contact with questions about Form I-693 and USCIS policies concerning health-related grounds of inadmissibility? So our office, the USCIS Office of Policy and Strategy, has created an email box dedicated to answering your questions. Please feel free to contact us at any time at opscivilsurgeons@uscis.dhs.gov. We also welcome feedback and suggestions there. And I just want to note that email box is open to the public in general as well. So we get questions from all over, and we're happy to help. And also, if it's something that we don't quite have the answer on, we can usually point you in the right direction. Okay, about time to wrap up. Thank you for your attention today. I know that we've covered a lot of ground. So for quick reference, this slide contains the various legal authorities governing the LPR and medical examination process. And then here are some helpful general resources that civil surgeons may wish to keep handy. There are links to USCIS's civil surgeon page, our policy manual parts that cover health-related grounds of inadmissibility, as well as civil surgeon designation and revocation. And then a link to the technical instructions as well. Okay, so as we talked about before, please make sure that you keep USCIS updated with current information. The easiest way actually to do so is by email. You know, especially in this day and age, you may not be always in the office as much as we used to be, but please keep your email address updated with USCIS. Keep your contact information, your phone number, your practice location. It's your responsibility to let us know. The National Benefit Center does handle this, and when they sent you a designation letter, then they included contact information for them. If you can't find that contact information, but you need to send USCIS a notification of these things, go ahead and reach out to us at OPS Civil Surgeons, and we'll get you hooked up with that information. Okay, so that's a wrap. I want to thank you all for taking the time to call in. We hope that we provided a good overview of this process for you, and we look forward to answering questions later on. Olivia, I'm not sure if we have a few extra minutes, but if you want to keep going with the other presentations, since we're going to be doing a Q&A later on, or if you want us to go through questions now.
Hi, it's Laura. I think we'll save most of the questions for the end since we have a dedicated time in the agenda for questions. We do have a few minutes available, and there are a couple of questions that I've seen coming in from multiple people. So maybe we can just take a few minutes to answer some of those commonly asked questions. So do you mind if I read off a couple of questions to you, and then we'll switch over to the next presentation?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. So one question I've seen a couple times here is if an application is rejected, and I think there was an error that it actually shouldn't have been rejected, is there any recourse, and what should I do or what should the patient do?
Thanks. Yeah, we do see this. Sometimes, civil surgeons that have been serving in their local communities for a long time may have ways of communicating with their local office, or they may not. So if you think that you have an applicant who's returned to you with an I-693 that's been rejected and you believe that it's been improperly rejected, if you don't have any contact at the local office, you can go ahead and send an email to us at OPS Civil Surgeons, and we can kind of help look into it. We've actually successfully done this a lot recently, where we were able to kind of confirm with CDC maybe that, the technical instructions were followed and that the application, the I-693 shouldn't have been rejected. So then we'll reach out to the local office and make sure that they contact the applicant with that.
Okay, great, thanks. A couple of people asked about what if a civil surgeon supervises other healthcare providers in the office, like a nurse practitioner or another doctor in the office? Would those people be able to do any aspects of the exam or the I-693 form, or does everything have to be done by the civil surgeon?
So for that question, I'm going to leave that to CDC to answer, because it kind of goes into the technical instructions specifically.
Okay. All right. If a civil surgeon diagnoses latent tuberculosis infection based on a positive blood test and a normal x-ray, is it required to treat latent TB infection, or can they go ahead and submit the I-693?
So
yeah, go ahead, Kim. Thanks.
Treatment's not required, but that needs to be, the positive test needs to be sent to the health department.
Okay, great. I'm going to do one more question that I've seen coming up a few times, and then maybe the rest of the questions we'll save to the end because some of them may cross over across multiple presenters. And some of the information might be coming up later. So the last thing that I've seen here a couple times is asking for clarification on refugees. In the presentation, we heard about what blanket positions that the health department need to do for refugees, but if you could provide a little more clarification on what refugees need for the I-693 form, and also what does a civil surgeon do if the refugee doesn't have documentation of the overseas exam?
Okay, so a refugee generally will need just the vaccination portion of the I-693, provided that they obtain their exam overseas and that there is no evidence that there was a Class A condition found overseas. I actually don't have a good answer for what if the refugee doesn't have like the evidence of that. I've gotten a lot of conflicting answers from the field over this. So that's something that I will look into a little bit more to give a more definitive answer, hopefully. A lot of you out there may have more experience with this.
Hey, Laura. So this is Kim. For refugees and their exams overseas, the CDC should have documentation or IOM. So if you guys are not able to find documentation of the exam, you can always try to contact us and we can see if we can find it somewhere in the medical records.
Thanks, Kim. And also, USCIS should have a copy as well. I'm not sure about the process if that happens very often. But again, that's one thing that if you find yourself unable to get that information, you could send us an email and we would be able to kind of help track that down, hopefully.
Okay, thanks so much, Laura and Sam. We are going to save the rest of the questions for the end of the webinar. I'm going to now introduce our next presenter, Dr. Kimberly Skrobarczyk, who's an internal medicine physician. She serves as a medical officer on the medical assessment and policy team in the Immigrant, Refugee, and Migrant Health Branch at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She began her career at CDC in 2016 working on infection control and outbreaks of hospital-acquired infections before transitioning to immigrant health in 2018. In her current role, she helps manage both the civil surgeon and panel physician programs.
All right. Morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a good start to your week and having a good start to your morning with us here. Let's see. Before I get started, my name is Dr. Kim Skrobarczyk. I'm on the Medical Assessment and Policy team at CDC. I'll be speaking today about the role of CDC in regards to the technical instructions. Before I start, I also want to extend my thanks to the organizers of this event. Even though, it's a difficult time for all of us, I'm excited that we can connect this way virtually. So after today's talk, you should understand the role of CDC regarding the technical instructions and also be familiar with the different CDC resources that are available for civil surgeons. So I won't be covering specifics for any of the technical instruction sections today, as there will be separate talks covering those throughout this webinar series. So first, I'd like to give a general overview of the role of CDC. By way of background, CDC has regulatory authority under 42 CFR Part 34 to govern the requirements of the status adjustment medical examination. And I'll give a little more detail on this in a few minutes. So in exercising this authority, CDC writes the technical instructions which stipulate the specific requirements for the exam. In addition, CDC serves as subject matter experts on determining if civil surgeons are following the technical instructions according to current medical standards of care. So as Laura mentioned, sometimes this involves advising UCIS during the adjudication of waiver requests or issues found when reviewing the I-693 form. We also respond to medical questions regarding the technical instructions directly from civil surgeons. So next, I wanted to explain who we are as a team and where we live within CDC. So we are within the Division of Global Migration and Quarantine, whose mission is to reduce morbidity and mortality among immigrants, refugees, travelers, expatriates, and other globally mobile populations, and to prevent the introduction, transmission, and spread of communicable diseases. So we sit in the Immigrant, Refugee, and Migrant Health Branch, and our team, the Medical Assessment and Policy team, deals specifically with immigrants and helps to manage the panel physician and civil surgeon programs. Although there is a separate team that deals specifically with refugees, we do have a lot of overlap. But our team is made up of a wide array of people, including physicians, public health specialists, epidemiologists, a laboratorian, and health education specialists. So I mentioned regulatory authority earlier, so let's talk a little more about that. Interestingly, DGMQ is one of the few places within CDC that has regulatory authorities, which comes from 3 different acts. And this is interesting because this is why when we write the technical instructions, they are requirements, and a lot of the other documents that CDC publishes are generally considered guidelines. So the Immigration and Nationality Act delegated authority to us for monitoring the required overseas medical exam, and it also further defined the conditions and diseases that were inadmissible, and you can see those listed on the slide. It was also later amended to require proof of vaccination for U.S.-bound immigrants. So the Refugee Act grants us an expanded role for identifying conditions of public health significance. We are responsible for staffing ports of entry to meet arriving refugees and for notifying and transferring medical information to health departments so that the refugees will have appropriate follow-up and treatment in the United States. And lastly, through federal quarantine regulations, the division has responsibility for preventing the importation and spread of infectious diseases in the United States. So essentially, these roles and authorities together provide CDC, and specifically our division, with a very unique responsibility and opportunity to improve immigrant and refugee health. So the objective of the medical exam for public health purposes is to identify the presence or absence of certain disorders that could result in exclusion from the U.S. under the provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act, including any Class A or Class B conditions. So this medical examination only screens for conditions required by U.S. immigration laws and regulations and is not meant to be a complete medical evaluation or checkup, meaning you do not need to test for things like cholesterol or give any vaccines that aren't specified in the technical instructions like zoster. So a Class A condition is a physical or mental disorder that renders the applicant ineligible for admission or adjustment of status. Now, this could be due to one of the communicable diseases of public health significance that is untreated, failure to show proof of required vaccinations, a physical or mental disorder associated with harmful behavior, or substance abuse or addiction. A Class B condition is a physical or mental disorder that, although does not constitute a specific excludable condition, represents a departure from normal health or well-being that is significant enough to possibly interfere with a person's ability to care for him or herself, disrupt attendance at school or work, or require extensive medical treatment or institutionalization in the future. So in general, this could be a treated Class A condition, non-infectious TB classifications, mental health disorders not associated with harmful behavior, or other relevant conditions noted in the past medical history. So what exactly are the technical instructions? So they stipulate to civil surgeons how to perform the exam, and they can be found on the CDC website. It covers all components of the exam, including the history, physical, chest x-rays, lab tests, vaccinations, and the mental health assessment. So when writing the instructions, our team consults with other subject matter experts within CDC for each specific component, like the Division for Tuberculosis Elimination, Division of STD Prevention, and the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases, to name a few. So I know that Laura touched on this earlier, but I'm going to discuss a little bit about who gets the exam by civil surgeons. So the exam is meant for status adjusters who are people applying for lawful permanent resident status while already in the U.S. on other terms. So these applicants are required to have a full medical screening, including vaccination, with a civil surgeon. However, there are some exceptions to this rule. For instance, K or V visa applicants have a medical exam overseas by a panel physician, which is valid for 1 year. However, they will need vaccinations by the civil surgeon if they did not receive them overseas. Refugees also have their medical exam overseas by a panel physician. Proof of vaccination is not required for refugee status, but it is required when adjusting their status in the U.S. So they will need vaccinations by a civil surgeon. Of note, a refugee will need to have their medical exam repeated by a civil surgeon while adjusting their status if the panel physician identified a Class A condition overseas. So lastly, I'd like to highlight a few helpful resources from CDC. So first, and most importantly, I'd like to discuss the Quality Assessment Program mailbox, because this is the best way to contact our team. The address is QAP civilsurgeons@cdc.gov. So civil surgeons can send us any questions about the technical instructions or any complicated patient situations. Questions are answered promptly, generally within 1 to 3 days, as the mailbox is monitored by our team Monday through Friday during business hours. So of note, the email address is not meant to be shared with the public, so it's not on our website. However, if you misplace this address and send an email to the general CDC info mailbox, they will direct your email to us. So next, we use email blasts or announcements to keep civil surgeons informed of updates, whether it's any changes to the technical instructions or upcoming trainings. The email list we use is given to us by USCIS, so make sure you provide a valid email address to USCIS and update them if it changes, or you can also email the QAP box to update us directly if an email change as well. So information about immigrant and refugee health and the examinations can be found on our website, which is also user-friendly for mobile devices. And specifically, make sure to reference the technical instructions website often for information regarding the exam. And be on the lookout for some upcoming changes and clarifications to the current instructions, including that genital exams for syphilis staging will only be allowed after laboratory confirmation of diagnosis, specifics regarding chaperone use during the physical exam, and likely changes to ages for syphilis and gonorrhea testing. These things are still being worked out and they're going through clearance, and when everything is official, the website will be updated and we will send out an email blast to let everyone know about the new technical instructions. So lastly, we do offer educational webinars led by our team about the technical instructions and other relevant parts of the exam. So be on the lookout for new webinars that will be coming in 2021. Obviously 2020 was a weird year, so some plans got derailed, but these webinars can either be viewed live or they can be accessed on web recordings later at the web address listed on this slide. So thank you for your attention, and remember that questions at any time can be sent to our team through the QAP Civil Surgeons mailbox. So I know I finished early, so I guess there's ample time for questions, or we can move on to the next speaker.
Hi, it's Laura Smock again. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We do have a lot of questions, but I'm thinking it might be best to save them for the end. And so I think next I'll introduce our next presenter. Dr. John Bernardo is a tuberculosis medical officer at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and a professor of medicine and research professor of biochemistry at the Boston University School of Medicine.
Well, thank you, Laura. Now for the easy part. Thanks for showing up this morning. By way of disclosure, I have no conflicts to report, and I'm not a civil surgeon. I have to give you folks credit for the important work you do today, and thank you for everything you do for us and our patients. First slide, please. There we go. Somebody change the slides. Can you have the next slide, please? by way of background, I'm going to be focusing this morning on persons in the United States who are applying for adjustment of status. These exams are performed by the civil surgeon, by you folks, in contrast to the overseas exams that are conducted by panel physicians. Technical instructions are the requirements that I'm seeing some comments here that you can't hear. Let me try this. This is better, I hope. Okay, thanks. So these technical instructions are the requirements that civil surgeons and panel physicians must follow, and as you heard, they're crafted by the CDC through the Division of Global Migration and Quarantine. The specific technical instructions for tuberculosis went into effect in October of 2018, and we're going to be going through this. Next slide, please. So the purpose, basically, is to focus on infectiousness. With the goal is to detect applicants who need further evaluation for pulmonary tuberculosis disease. And this specifically usually involves the lungs, the pleura, the airways, including the larynx, and the thoracic lymph nodes. And again, the emphasis for the status adjustment exam is on infectiousness. The goal is to ensure that those who are diagnosed are treated and thus reduce the risk of spread of TB among the U.S. population. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to start with a little very basic TB. I'm going to call it TB 100. Next slide, please. Well, this is how we catch TB. TB is an infectious disease. It's communicable through the air, and usually infection occurs following unsuspected contact with an infectious person with tuberculosis. Gee, I'm sorry. I'm seeing these comments coming up that I'm not being heard. I don't know what to do about that. I've turned up the volume and doing everything I can with the microphone here. And I apologize. When somebody is exposed to a patient with unsuspected tuberculosis, and that's infectious, like Dad here in the room, they breathe the contents of the air that is in the room and infected with droplets that contain viable organisms. Can I have the next slide, please?
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I think if you back up maybe a little bit from your microphone, it may be a little bit more clear.
Okay. Okay, we'll try that. Okay, now when the kids, is this better?
I think so.
Yes,
Okay.
that's better.
Okay. When the others in the room who are naive to tuberculosis inhale those droplets, they develop infection. And infection can be seen sometimes on a chest radiograph, like the X-ray I'm showing you here of primary tuberculosis in a child. There's usually a pneumonitis that is located in a region of the lung, usually the lingular or middle lobe or the lower lobes of the lungs, with reactive lymphadenopathy related to the draining lymph nodes for that region of the lung. Clinically, this often goes undetected. Have the next slide, please. But not everybody who's exposed to TB becomes infected. In fact, the infection rate is quite low. It's not like the flu or COVID by any means. You need a relatively long period of exposure to become infected with tuberculosis. So it's estimated that from contact studies that exposure to TB results in infection in only about 30% of people who are exposed. Among those, what happens subsequently is a sensitization of the immune response to recognize tuberculosis and contain the organisms. This process takes between 4 and 12 weeks usually and results in containment of the organisms by the immune process that adapts to the exposure and contains the organisms in various locations of the body, because during the 4 to 12 weeks following exposure, the organisms get ingested by pulmonary macrophages and disseminate through the lymphatics and bloodstream to the rest of the body. In most cases, like I say, more than 90%, this process results in containment at different sites throughout the body, and we call this clinical latency. In fewer than 10%, however, and especially in young kids, that is under the age of 5, and people with suppression of their immune system, like HIV infection, the primary infection will progress to give you primary progressive tuberculosis, and this is not uncommonly seen in young children. TB in young kids, though, is not usually infectious. Have the next slide. In an adult who has contained tuberculosis, reactivation can result over time and result in a type of tuberculosis we call adult tuberculosis, as is classically shown on this radiograph with a right upper lobe infiltrate. The sputum in somebody like this is likely to be positive when it's stained appropriately for acid-fast bacilli. And these people tend to be infectious and can spread tuberculosis to others. Next slide. But testing for tuberculosis is difficult because there is no really good test for TB infection. In fact, there is no test for a latent TB infection. The tests that we use measure immune recall to the TB antigens that the person was sensitized to in the remote past. Latent TB infection is defined clinically, basically as a positive recall response with no clinical or radiographic evidence of TB disease. Importantly, the current tests we use do not predict who will develop disease. And so we have to focus our testing. And in clinical practice in the United States, we test only high-risk people. And for the most part, most of our cases of active tuberculosis result from reactivation of latent infection and development of disease that tends to be the type of disease that can be spread to others, as in the slide that I just showed you. Can I have the next slide? With latency, the bacteria becomes contained by the adaptive immune response, and the replication of the bacteria slows down. The ideal replication time for M. tuberculosis is about 20 hours. And in these granulomas, the bacteria slow their replication time to days, weeks, months, and they, in fact, change their metabolic activity, and they adapt to the low oxygen tension and high lipid content of the granuloma, and stay in that state until at a future time they can wake up and become active and result in active tuberculosis disease. There's a risk of reactivation for the lifetime of the individual who's infected, and classically it's between 7 and 10% over the lifetime of the individual. Go to the next slide. We used to think of this as a dichotomous situation. You either have latent TB or you have active TB. There's been some nice studies that are pioneered by Joanne Flynn and her group out in Pittsburgh using macaque monkeys. And they've demonstrated that what we're really dealing with is a continuum. There is a constant struggle between the bacteria to reactivate that's opposed by the constant attempt by the host to contain that infection within the granulomas. And this results in either latency on the bottom of the slide here, or active tuberculosis when the bacteria wins out over the host containment system and results in active disease. Most of the time, more than 70% of the time, this happens in the lungs, and we have active pulmonary tuberculosis that can be infectious to others. And this is the group of people we're trying to focus on with this examination. Have the next slide, please. Now, how do we test for infection? Well, the old test, the standard test we use, is the tuberculous skin test. This test was first invented more than 100 years ago, and only recently was modified, and that is in 1936. And it's the only standardized test of delay type hypersensitivity that we really have. Can I have the next slide? It's well standardized. It's standardized in terms of how it's given and how it's interpreted. And we all know that the tuberculous skin test is not a very specific test because the proteins used for the TB antigens are not specific to Mycobacteria tuberculosis. The response to the skin test is a reflection of cellular infiltration into the site where the solution was injected. And it's interpreted as a measurement of the induration, which is the infiltration of cells into that site over 48 to 72 hours after the test is administered. And it's read, it's interpreted on basis of risk. For our purposes, a 10 millimeter test is a positive test, unless they're a contact to somebody with active tuberculosis or immunocompromised or have a lesion on their chest radiograph that's consistent with old tuberculosis that we know about. Can I have the next slide? More recently, we've developed tests that are more specific and use antigens that are not cross-reactive with other bacteria, the Mycobacteria genus, and will not, for the most part, interfere with the test results. So there are two general platforms that are now approved by the FDA for use in the United States. One is QuantiFERON, which was first approved in 2001, but in its latest iteration was approved in 2018, and a T-spot test that was approved in 2008. These are in vitro tests for cell-mediated immunity to M. tuberculosis antigens, and they utilize whole blood that's incubated in the presence of protein antigens that are secreted by M. tuberculosis complex and only a few other non-tuberculosis mycobacteria. These antigens are used to stimulate sensitized T cells to secrete gamma interferon, and the assays for QuantiFERON and T-spot are readouts of these reactions. Next slide, please. So there's the new test for QuantiFERON is called the Gold Plus test, and it's set up with negative control and a positive control. The negative control has no stimulus in it. The positive control uses what we call a mitogen that stimulates cells non-specifically to secrete gamma interferon. 2-1 in this complex of tubes includes two antigens, they're peptides, that are secreted by M. tuberculosis complex organisms, and they're chosen because of their ability to stimulate sensitized CD4 cells to make gamma interferon. TUBE2 is the new iteration of the test that resulted in the plus designation, which includes now a second tube that has in it TUBE1 antigens plus fragments of these antigens that are designed supposedly to stimulate sensitized CD8 cells and improve the sensitivity of the assay. Now, the next slide. But the assay itself is a very complex thing. You have to pay attention to how the tubes are stored, how the blood is drawn, how it's injected into the tubes, what is done with the tubes afterwards, how long the tubes are incubated, usually overnight, and the plasma following this incubation is harvested and sent over to an ELISA, and a standard curve is used as a control, and we develop readings for each of those tubes that are based on the secretion of gamma interferon by T lymphocytes in each of these tubes. Can I have the next slide? The interpretation is fairly straightforward, and I won't get into it in detail, but the positive result is a reading of greater than 0.35 international units in either tube 1, which has the tube 1 antigens in it, the long peptides for CD4, or the tube 2, which has CD4 and CD8 peptides in it. If either of those or both are greater than 0.35 units per ml, it's a positive test. A negative test is less than 0.035 with other criteria that relate to the mitogen and nil tubes. And the indeterminate test happens occasionally, ideally fewer than 5% of the time, where the assay really doesn't work. Next slide, please. The T-spot test is similar but different. It's based on the ability of effector T cells to generate gamma interferon on stimulation with these same two TB antigens. There's ESAT6 and CFP10. And there's a nil and a mitogen response that's also elicited. But rather than incubate the whole blood with the antigens, the blood is drawn up, and then mononuclear cells, PBMCs we call them, are isolated using a density gradient centrifugation. The cells are washed, the mononuclear cells are washed and counted. And they're suspended at a standard number of cells per well and put into various wells along with either no stimulus, mitogen, or ESAT6 or CFP10. And those are incubated overnight. The individual cells are then examined under a microscope after they're developed. And cells that are secreting gamma interferon are viewed by looking at the circle of gamma interferon that's secreted around each cell. Each cell that makes gamma interferon lights up in the assay, and the number of cells is counted, and that's how you get your response. Go to the next slide. So with this test, you get a count. Positive test is greater than 8 spots when you subtract the controls. Borderline test is 5, 6, or 7 spots, and a negative test is fewer than 4 spots. Now the next step. So the gamma interferon tests are not risk-based interpreted. They are, however, interpreted otherwise the same way as a skin test. A negative test has the same connotation as a negative skin test. Positive test is the same interpretation as a positive skin test, which requires medical evaluation and a chest x-ray to confirm TB or exclude the diagnosis. An indeterminate test is an indication of test failure where we recommend repeating the test, and the T-spot has a borderline region, 5, 6, or 7 spots that suggest that you repeat the test. It's neither positive nor negative. Next slide. So the technical instructions now have changed, as I mentioned, in October of 2018. And one of the major points is that the skin test is no longer acceptable in persons who are 2 years of age or older. For people older than 2 years of age, an IGRA is required. And this is a sort of process diagram that we copied out of the technical instruction guidance statement from CDC. That's available as a PDF. Can I have the next slide? So the process involves evaluation of applicants that you normally do, and all applicants who are 2 years of age or older have to have a gamma interferon release test. Skin test is no longer acceptable. All applicants with a positive IGRA, known HIV infection, or signs and symptoms of TB disease must have a history and physical exam and a chest radiograph. Now, HIV testing is not a requirement of the screening. It may be done if clinically indicated, but the applicants don't have to be tested, and specifically do not have to be tested by the civil surgeon. However, if the test is done, the civil surgeon is required to report those results. Okay. Applicants with known HIV must provide sputum for microscopy and culture, regardless of IGRA and chest X-ray results, to rule out TB disease. So if you know somebody has HIV infection, or if the person is tested by you and found to have HIV infection, they need to have sputum sent. However, civil surgeons who are independent of departments of health must not refer the applicant to a health department for an IGRA or a chest X-ray. This has to be done by the civil surgeon. Can I have the next slide? People with positive IGRAs in the past need to have documentation of the date of the test, the type of test that was performed, either quantiferon or T-spot, the results, standard units of measurements. Now, each laboratory will give you a numerical result, either in terms of international units of gamma interferon or in terms of numbers of spots. With this, you must include the interpretation of the test, positive, negative, indeterminate, or borderline, and the testing physician's name, signature, and the office information. And this is for people who come to you with positive IGRAs in the past. A past positive IGRA must have a chest X-ray. If the chest X-ray is negative with no signs or symptoms of TB, the person is reported to local public health as LTBI. If the person also has completed LTBI treatment and you have documentation of that, the person is classified as no Class A or Class TB, and reporting is not required. So if you have a negative X-ray with a positive gamma interferon test and the patient's completed treatment, reporting is not required to the local health department. Next slide. So in addition to the IGRAs, patients need to have their medical exam done, and with respect to TB, it should be focused to elicit TB risk factors. including previous TB infection or disease, contact with a known case, or medical risk factors that raise one's risk for developing TB, especially if they are infected. It should reflect signs and symptoms of tuberculosis, which typically can be nonspecific and constitutional, or focused to the site of disease within the individual. This might include cough for more than 3 weeks, fevers, night sweats, and unexplained weight loss. If they're previously diagnosed with TB disease in the U.S., the civil surgeon should attempt to obtain records. If the patient has been vaccinated with BCG, this is reviewed and recorded if the documentation of that vaccination and the date of receipt of the vaccination are available. Next slide. The physical exam should be focused, and the technical instructions are specific as to what needs to be done, including palpation and examination for lymphadenopathy, thorough pulmonary and abdominal exam. And again, the focus here should be on identifying people who might have active communicable tuberculosis disease. The chest X-ray is required if there's a positive IGRA result, or if the person is known to have HIV infection, regardless of the IGRA result, or signs and symptoms of tuberculosis disease, regardless of the IGRA result, or have extrapulmonary tuberculosis, regardless, again, of their IGRA result. Pregnant women may defer the chest X-ray and the examination at their discretion. The technical instructions, again, are very prospective. They require a PA chest view, a posterior, anterior direction view of the chest in an adult. And for our purposes here, an adult is anybody 10 years of age and older. If you're under 10, PA or an anterior posterior view and a lateral are required. There are specific requirements that apply to how the X-ray is read on specific types of equipment. The request itself should be labeled suspicion for tuberculosis, and the film should be digital films. The chest X-ray must be read by both the civil surgeon and the radiologist, with results to be available within 1 week. Next slide. For children under 2 years of age, they should undergo a history and physical exam. And for known HIV infected children or those with signs or symptoms consistent with TB, they should have a skin test. An IGRA may be performed at the discretion of the clinician, but the main recommendation here is for a skin test. The chest X-ray, as I mentioned before, should be an AP or PA view with the lateral view included. And the purpose of the lateral view is to detect adenopathy or maybe a pleural effusion that you may not see on a straight PA view or AP view. And then for those who are HIV infected or with signs or symptoms consistent with TB, they should be reported to the health department for further evaluation. Next slide. So, what do you do when you have this information? All applicants with an abnormal X-ray suggestive of TB disease must be referred to the health department of jurisdiction for further evaluation. Those with symptoms or signs suggestive of TB or known HIV infection also must be referred, regardless of the chest radiograph or the IGRA result. Civil surgeons must not classify, issue medical clearance for TB, or sign the I-693 form until the applicant returns from the local health department with documentation of the results of the TB evaluation by the health department. The health department of jurisdiction will determine whether the applicant has TB disease and needs treatment. This is not the responsibility of the civil surgeon. All applicants diagnosed with latent TB infection must be reported to the local health department. the I-693 can be filled out and given to the applicant, and the applicant should receive education about the importance of treating TB infection, although it's not required to complete the adjustment process. So treatment of LTBI is not required. Next slide. This slide sort of outlines the TB classifications as detailed in the new technical instructions from 2018. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, other than to show you there's a new class called B0 that includes pulmonary TB that's diagnosed by the civil surgeon and the health department, and they have completed treatment by directly observed therapy. For these folks, travel is permitted 3 months following. Next slide.
And Dr. Bernardo, sorry to interrupt, but we're losing your audio a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, yeah. Is that better?
Yep, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. And with respect to treatment, all applicants diagnosed with TB disease who need treatment must receive a classification of Class A TB and are not cleared until successful completion of the treatment, regardless of the diagnostic criteria. TB may be diagnosed by the health department using microbiologic criteria or what we call clinical criteria. And so once they're started on therapy, they're not cleared until they're cleared by the health department. While the treatment may be directed by the health department, it also may be conducted by the civil surgeon or a physician under contract or working for the Department of Health. There is a Class A waiver that allows for people who are under treatment and otherwise are not allowed to travel. This is an exception here. And the Form 601 is required and is reviewed by DHS with DGMQ assistance on an individual basis. And the determination is made on a case-by-case basis here. Next slide. When treatment has been completed, the health department must sign the referral evaluation. That's Part 9 of the I-693 form. It documents the person has completed treatment and comply with public health follow-up. The civil surgeon changes the status to Class B0 pulmonary TB and completes the civil surgeon certification section, indicating that for TB purposes, the patient is medically cleared. You have to indicate specifically the drug regimen used, the date treatment was started, the date treatment was completed, and the dates and results of the most recent sputum culture in month and year. Next slide. So in review, the primary changes to the civil surgeon's technical instructions include the requirement that civil surgeons use an IGRA instead of a skin test in all applicants who are 2 years of age or older. Latent TB infection needs to be reported to the local Department of Public Health, and it's required now instead of recommended. And there's a Class B0, there's a new category for people who complete TB disease treatment during the status adjustment process. I believe that's the end. Next slide. Nope, that is. Answer questions. Okay. And I apologize again for the audio.
Great, thank you, Dr. Bernardo. So, Laura, do you want to start with questions, or should I? We've had a couple come in.
Yeah, one question I've seen a lot is how will participants be able to access slides and the recording after the webinar is done?
Yeah, so we will make the slides and a recording of the presentation available. It won't be available immediately after the webinar, but we can let everyone who attended know via email once those are ready.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask a few of the tuberculosis questions that came in, and then after I ask those, Olivia, maybe I'll turn it back to you for some more questions.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, so what's the difference between latent TB, inactive TB, and the clinical latency stage of TB, Dr. Bernardo? Are those all the same thing?
Yes and no. Latent TB is a clinical state where there's TB infection and no clinical or radiographic evidence of tuberculosis beyond that primary infection that occurred. Inactive TB is TB that affects whatever part of the body it affected and has been treated, leaving residual, like scars in the lung or elsewhere in the body. So latent TB is a common condition. 25% of the world is infected with TB. Still, TB is the leading killer of human beings in the world today among infectious diseases. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And can you remind us what class should be used on the form for latent TB?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, in the slides you said that active disease is class A until it's completely treated, and then it's B0. One of the questions was asking for clarification on if it's just latent TB infection, is that class B or?
It's not reportable to DMQ, I believe. If you pull up my slide there, back to that slide. That's B2, I guess.
B2.
Infections, B2.
Okay, B2, thank you.
I should have known that one.
If a patient had a positive quantiferon test and a normal x-ray done prior to the immigration medical exam, maybe they had it done with their primary care recently, is that valid, or do the IGRA and the x-ray have to be repeated as part of the immigration medical exam?
There are specific requirements about the testing and treatment, including the radiographs. So I'll leave that to my CDC colleagues and see what they'll accept. For our purposes in public health, treatment of latent infection should be recommended, and once it's completed, repeat examinations like radiographs need not be done unless the patient develops symptoms. Once you have a positive test for infection, be it a skin test or a gamma interferon test, then you don't need to have that repeated. And one other point, as long as I'm mentioning this, if a patient has had a positive skin test and subsequently had a negative gamma interferon test, the negative gamma interferon test is the one that governs the subsequent action here. So CDC ignores the positive skin test in this setting.
Yes, and so when the applicant comes to the civil surgeon really needs to complete the IGRA and the chest x-ray because they're the ones that can, you know, authorize that this is the applicant. They can verify their identity. They have verified the laboratory and the chest x-ray facility that's completing the exam. Now, if there's a previous positive IGRA, that does not need to be repeated. And if an applicant has recently seen the civil surgeon and they are the ones that have completed a recent IGRA exam, then depending on the timing of the exam and the previous IGRA by that same civil surgeon, they may not need to repeat it.
Would they need to repeat the x-ray?
Yes, x-rays are meant to be a current evaluation of someone's risk for tuberculosis, so it needs to be current.
Okay. And what if someone is currently taking treatment for latent TB infection like isoniazid or rifampin that was prescribed recently by another provider? Does that person need to redo the x-ray for the immigration medical exam?
So if they come to a civil surgeon and are on treatment for LTBI, the civil surgeon will need to do a chest x-ray as part of the exam.
Yeah, there are specific criteria for the x-ray too. So
yeah,
those are spelled out in detail in the technical instructions.
Dr. Bernardo, what, in your opinion, is the best treatment for latent TB?
Well, best treatment for latent TB is that's agreed upon by the patient and by the clinician. Some people would rather take a regimen like rifampin for 4 months. That is recommended by CDC. Or alternatively, people may want to take 9 months of isoniazid. The longer regimen with isoniazid probably has more toxicity, but we have most experience with it. Rifampin-based regimens are shorter. 4 months of rifampin is shorter than 9 months of isoniazid. It probably has less toxicity, but rifampin and the other rifamycins cross-react or interact with many drugs. And so you have to take that into consideration. And one of the drugs that they cross-react with or interfere with is birth control pills or injections. And so if you start somebody on a regimen with rifampin or a rifamycin-based regimen, you run the risk of pregnancy if it's a woman on birth control who's sexually active. There's another regimen that the CDC recommends. It's once a week, isoniazid with rifampin, and that has been studied in selected patients. We don't use it very much, but it's an option. We don't use it here in Massachusetts very much, but it's an option. And it should be given by directly observed therapy. And I should add, though, that lately there have been some issues with nitrosamine contamination of rifamycins, including rifampin and rifampin. And the FDA has announcements out on this with specific recommendations from CDC on the use of rifamycins and TB. So I don't have time to get into those, but if you want to use a rifamycin to treat tuberculosis infection, you might want to review the information there and discuss it with your patients.
Okay, thank you. And a few people have asked for clarification. Can you repeat, Dr. Skrobarchak, if someone has a history of a positive IGRA, please confirm they don't need to repeat if they're bringing documentation of that. Or is there a certain time period within which you would accept it? And for the x-ray, if they've had a recent x-ray, how long is considered current?
So the IGRA, if it's a positive IGRA, it doesn't need to be repeated because it will most likely be positive again. So they'll still need a chest x-ray. So they'll just, if they have the results from the IGRA and it's not, a handwritten piece of paper that, says positive IGRA, if it is a laboratory document that shows a date and positive IGRA result that can be verified, then just proceed directly to the chest x-ray. And in general, when the applicant comes to the civil surgeon, then the civil surgeon needs to complete the components of the exam. And that applies to the chest x-ray, and it will most likely need to have the chest x-ray from the civil surgeon. Now,
Thank you for that.
Yeah, if it's like the day before for some other reason, then, you can email us, but I don't feel like that situation is going to arise often.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask a few questions next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a couple more TB-related questions I'll go ahead and ask. So what is the best way to report LTBI to the health department? And is there some sort of online portal available?
Yeah, that's a good question. TB is reportable in some jurisdictions, and some jurisdictions it's not. In Massachusetts, where I hang out, it is reportable. And we have a certain process. There's a website where it's not a reportable condition. You need to pick up the phone or get onto your local public health department's website and determine how the further workup is going to be managed by the Department of Health there. Again, it varies by jurisdiction.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. I often get very borderline IGRA results. Should those be repeated? Should the test be repeated?
The textbook answer would be no. You get the result, positive or negative. A borderline test for a T-spot, according to the manufacturer and current recommendations, should be repeated. So that's probably the answer there. And the same thing with an indeterminate test. It should be repeated. The problem is the patient usually pays for these tests, and they're very expensive, and that makes it very difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and you can see on the form that it says the indeterminate results, including borderline or equivocal, can be marked on the form, and no chest x-ray is required for those results.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, next question, and this might have partially been answered. When latent TB is identified and reported to the public health department, what should the civil surgeons do with the I-693 envelope? And should they include a referral documentation? I'm sorry, what should they put in the I-693 envelope? And should they include referral documentation?
I don't know the answer to that specifically. I would think so, since now there's a requirement to report to the local public health that patient has latent TB infection.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have some other questions, and I see there's some more TB questions coming in, so maybe we can circle back to those as well. Okay, so next question. So I work for an urgent care group that has 4 different locations. Can I do immigration physicals at all of the locations, or just the ones listed on my designation form?
Hi, this is Laura. Thanks for the question. Yes, please, you need to inform USCIS of all the locations where you will be conducting the examinations. So it's totally fine to conduct the exams at all 4 of those locations, but you need to update with the National Benefit Center to let them know of those locations.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. I have some people calling and insisting that they only need vaccination forms filled out and don't need a physical because they had a physical done outside the country already. Can you please advise the best way to handle that?
Yeah,
so
that could be those.
Sorry,
go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just saying that it's going to depend on, okay, you go. I'm stopping.
No, yeah, as far as like the refugees, there's a certain categories, the K visas, for example, as well, that does happen. So they hopefully will have a copy of the exam to provide for you to show. If they don't, I would advise them for your information, obviously, to make the best determination about how to proceed, to obtain a copy of that to provide for you before.
Okay, great. I know we touched on translation services, but there were quite a few questions about that. So one of the questions is, if a civil surgeon speaks the same language as the applicant, is a translator needed?
Yeah, we did touch on that. Just please, if you are conducting the exam in another language, that can be something that you can note in the Part 11 notes section to say that no translation was necessarily done during the examination, but that it was conducted in whatever language it was done. And then please also fill out the interpreter section listing your name as the interpreter for that.
And if a telephone interpreter is used, how would they sign the form, or should they sign the form?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, they need to go ahead, if they're able to print out the form on their own wherever they are located, go ahead and sign it and then provide a copy via fax or email or however they can get it to the civil surgeon to include. And that can be another thing that can be noted as to why that's kind of separate there in the as an attachment to the original form. I do see the comments and the questions that some of these companies don't allow for that. We hadn't really been aware of that issue before, so that's something that we can look towards to address maybe in January with our next Q&A. My advice now is to continue doing what you're doing if USCIS is accepting it. We realize that, you know, in this day and age, there's just a lot of different factors that go into these things, and so do your best, and we will try and see if we can get some more answers on that.
Okay, great, thank you. And this may have been touched on as well. I apologize if I'm repeating anything. There were a couple questions about minors signing their forms. So one question is if the I-693 will be rejected if a parent has signed for those under 18, and what age can a minor sign by him or herself?
So we do have an official policy on this for USCIS. It's age 14 and above that they can sign for themselves and should sign for themselves. As to whether it will be rejected for that, I can't speak that will happen 100%. However, that is what we do have in our policy. So if you have a child who is 14 years old, they should be signing for themselves, of course, with the exception of those who may not be able to do so, and if they are under legal guardianship, even into adulthood.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question here. So when exactly does the patient sign their form? Is that on the date of the exam or when all the documents come back and are ready?
So this is a question that we have been getting more frequently, and the way that the instructions are written, it's kind of written differently in a couple different places, and so it's something that we're looking to update. We want to allow flexibility for the civil surgeon. So the important thing to remember is that the examination, that the signature needs to take place in front of the civil surgeon. If that's when all of the examination has been completed, or whether that's at the beginning, kind of giving permission for the civil surgeon to conduct the exam. We are working on that situation, but the idea is to make sure that it is done in front of the civil surgeon.
Okay, great. And I see a couple questions coming in as well, if the parents can be included as the preparers on the form.
Right. No, the parents filling out the forms for their minor children do not need to be included as preparers.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Laura, is it okay if I pass the questions back to you?
Yes, sounds good. So I'm going to ask a multi-part question about expiration dates on forms. A few questions actually came in about expiration dates. So here's the first part. My understanding is that from the date the I-693 is signed, the clock is ticking and the applicant has 60 days to submit the form to USCIS. Otherwise, it'll be invalid. Is this correct?
So I'm sorry, I think what I heard was about the 60-day requirement. I know it's a little confusing. The date of the civil surgeon's signature on the I-693 can be no earlier than 60 days prior to the applicant's application for adjustment of status. So say you have a patient who came to see you on today, November 17th, and they have not filed for adjustment of status yet. They need to submit their application for the I-485 no more than 60 days after today's date. And that is not the, it's not the interview date or anything like that. That's simply the date that they gather all their paperwork and officially submit it to USCIS. I know that the 60-day rule isn't exactly the most popular. It could be. We are currently looking at that. I can't make any promises soon, but we definitely know that it's not. It doesn't work for a lot of people, so it is under review.
Okay. And does one of the forms have to be done before the other? Is it the I-485 first or the I-693 first, or does it not matter?
No. Yeah, so the applicant can go ahead and submit their I-485. At this time, they can go ahead and submit that without the medical exam and then do the exam later. A lot of times what they'll get is USCIS will send a notice kind of telling them, we've received your I-485, but we don't have a medical exam, so go ahead and get that done, sort of thing. Or in a more formal request in an RFE, a request for evidence, they'll get it that way and tell them that they need to go get the exam done and send it in. But yes, the exam can be done after the I-485 application.
Okay. And if the civil surgeon is making a referral, as part of their findings in the exam, what if there's a long delay in the applicant being able to get their appointment for that referral? If the civil surgeon just makes an explanation about the delay on the I-693, is that sufficient, or do the deadlines come into play?
Right. So any documentation, any notes like that the civil surgeon can provide as to reasons for delays, et cetera, are always appreciated. We can't make guarantees for every single case as to what will be accepted and not. I can say that in this era of COVID, USCIS has officially allowed for more time on requests for evidence. For example, realizing that applicants are having a difficult time with all aspects of this process right now. So even without requesting official extensions for these requests for evidence, the applicant gets 60 days extra before they would need to submit documentation that's been requested by USCIS.
Okay. An interesting COVID question came into the chat box. Will COVID-19 be considered as either Class A or Class B condition? And should it be documented on the I-693? And in the future, will civil surgeons need to test for coronavirus?
Hi, so this is Kim. I can handle that question. Currently, COVID testing is not required. Technically, COVID and SARS are covered by some of the federal regulations. However, the testing is not required. If you follow the general technical instructions, which say if someone is acutely ill for some other reason other than tuberculosis, you can defer the exam until that person is well. So at this point, if someone comes to you short of breath or coughing, I would tell them to go home and you can complete the exam at a later period of time. If someone is diagnosed with COVID, they should not come in for an exam until they meet the guidelines for ending home isolation. If someone comes to you and says, I was previously diagnosed with COVID, you can, kind of at your discretion, you can choose to put that in Class B other if they want to provide you that information and a laboratory test, but it is not required for the immigration medical exam.
Thank you. I'm going to revisit this question about nurse practitioners because I don't think we had time to hear the answer before. If a civil surgeon supervises nurse practitioners or physicians or other healthcare providers in the office, is it acceptable for any of those providers to do the exam? Or does it have to be the civil surgeon that does the entire exam and signs the form?
So the answer, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kim.
I was going to say for the answer from CDC is whoever is completing and signing the form needs to be the person completing the medical exam.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is it's not acceptable for, let's say, the nurse practitioner to do the exam and then the civil surgeon in the office to sign the form.
Correct.
And I'm assuming if it's the nurse practitioner signing the form, that form would probably be rejected because that person isn't a designated civil surgeon. Is that correct, Laura and Sam?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, so the civil surgeon should do it all.
Correct.
Thank you. If a private civil surgeon decides to change their place of work and to work for a health department, would that civil surgeon still be able to do immigration physicals while working for the health department?
So from USCIS's standpoint, this physician can wear two hats. The important thing is that they're doing the exam based on the applicant's, based on their role. So if they are conducting a vaccination examination completion for a refugee adjusting status in their role as a health department physician, then they can go ahead and do so with that role. However, they can also be a private civil surgeon and conduct those exams for those other people, just in a separate role. But yes, we don't regulate that they can only be one or the other.
Okay, thank you. Olivia, are you ready for me to turn it back to you for some more questions?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, question for you, Dr. Bernardo. If a child over the age of 2 to 4 is not cooperating with a TB blood test, what are the other options available?
Depends on the civil surgeon and the agency itself. There are no substitutions according to the technical instructions. You have to have an IGRA in the circumstance.
Okay.
As far as I know.
Okay, great.
And it has to be one of the two specified.
Okay. And is it requested that all screening blood tests for TB, syphilis, gonorrhea should be ordered or done by the civil surgeon? And are there any sort of time frame restrictions for those tests?
Yes, the All of the laboratory tests for the civil surgeon exam need to be ordered by the civil surgeon.
Okay. Okay. And are there any sort of time frame restrictions for that?
I mean, I guess if technically you knew someone was an adult and was going to need syphilis and gonorrhea, you know, I guess before they came into your office, you could send them to the lab before the exam, but it would need to be by the civil surgeon for the exam date that's going to be on the form. So if it's technically the laboratory date is 1 or 2 days before that exam, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And another TV question: if a patient quantiferon comes back positive and has a chest X-ray that's showing other forms of pulmonary infection like pneumonia, should the exam be rescheduled until that's treated? Yes.
So, and this actually is in the tuberculosis technical instructions. So basically, if there is something like a large infection that could be treated, that infection should be treated and allow 1 to 2 weeks for the chest X-ray to resolve, and then they can return to complete the exam.
Yeah, this is John. I think the specification says 8 weeks to repeat the X-ray.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but they also specify not using the fluoroquinolone for treating a pulmonary infection because it may also partially treat TB.
Okay.
So that's the kind of detail they go into that.
Okay. And if a patient declines to have their chest radiograph done due to pregnancy, how should the paperwork be filled out?
So if they are deferring the chest X-ray, then they are deferring the entire medical exam, and so the form cannot be completed.
Okay.
Now, the chest X-ray is a requirement, and this includes pregnant women. The radiation is really minimal, and also if women are pregnant and need the chest X-ray, they should have a double-wrapped lead shield placed around their abdomen to protect them. And this is our stance for not only in the U.S., but also for panel physicians overseas. And we don't feel like this is a high risk to the pregnant woman. However, they need to consent, and they are also welcome to defer the exam if they do not wish to have the chest X-ray done.
Okay, great. And I just saw another radiograph question come in. If a chest X-ray with nonspecific findings comes in, can a CAT scan of the chest be done and those results be considered definitive?
No, the CT scans are not used for the civil surgeon or panel physician exam.
Okay. Another question. Can a medical resident or an ID fellow do the interview or exam if a civil surgeon is in the room observing and supervising?
I mean, I guess technically if the civil surgeon is in the room while the person is taking the history, that's fine, because then they can always ask additional questions if that person misses them. But the civil surgeon needs to be the one completing the physical exam. And if the trainee completes an exam and the applicant is willing, that's fine, but that's not acceptable. It will need to be repeated by the civil surgeon.
Okay, great, thank you. So in Section 4 of the I-693, for medical chronic conditions, should all medications and prognoses be written down as well? I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Yeah. So on section 4 of the form for chronic conditions, should medications and the prognosis be written down in that section as well when noting down chronic conditions?
Is that section 4 of part 8?
Yeah, it's section 4 of part 8. The civil surgeon worksheet is part 8, and then section 4 is where we list the other
other medical conditions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so this is also, I saw a few other questions about what to put in Class B for Class B other conditions. And as it says here, hypertension or diabetes, regardless of whether it's well controlled or not. So anything, and this could be like coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure, any chronic or hypothyroidism, I saw that, that can be placed here in this box.
Okay. Okay, great. And is there a black or blue ink requirement for signing off on the I-693 form?
Hey, this is Laura. You know what? I'd have to get back to you on that. I believe, Sam, I don't know if you're still on the line. I think we had this question before, and I think we may have found an official answer, but I can't recall off the top of my head right now.
Okay.
So whatever you're doing right now, if it's working, go ahead and continue doing it, and we'll double check on that one.
Okay, great. Okay, another question. I had a patient come in and he had an exam in May of this year. He said that USCIS has lost its application and needs another sealed copy. Since all testing should be done at time of the visit, how should I handle this? Do we need to repeat the exam or print out the same application and change the date of the signature?
Okay, so he just had an exam done.
In May.
So I believe that the medical exam is valid for a year, Laura? And this is just technically like a recopying of the, like redoing the form?
So it gets a little tricky here because it's actually valid once it's submitted for 2 years. So 2 years from the date of the civil surgeon's signature, as long as it was submitted 60 days before. When we get this question at USCIS, we, because we aren't an agency that covers medical questions, issues, we usually tell the civil surgeon to make their best professional judgment as to whether the I-693 as completed relays the current state of health of the applicant. It's tricky, but we also defer to CDC as to like specific guidelines for redoing of the tests and realizing that the technical instructions do say that the exam needs to be current and completed. It's meant to be a snapshot in time of the applicant's current state of health.
Okay, great, thank you. I saw a couple questions come in about envelopes. So one of them was, I always write do not open on the back of the envelope, but should that be written on the front?
Yeah, go ahead and follow the instructions as it's listed in the I-693. I believe it says to do it on the back and front, but I would have to double check on that. Whatever it says, it does give clear instructions in the form instructions.
Okay. Okay, great. Laura, can I pass the questions back to you?
Sure. It looks like a few people are commenting that black ink must be used. Okay. One person asked, can patients use their insurance cards to pay for the blood tests?
So if the civil surgeon's office accepts their insurance, then yes. I'm not sure exactly how that works. In general, it was my understanding that for some reason insurance can't be used for this exam, but you can always try.
Okay, and one person made a comment that some of these vaccines are very expensive for the adult applicants, and the question is there any federal effort to provide civil surgeons with access to any affordable catch-up vaccine programs?
You know, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any, and, you know, the vaccines are generally some of the, you know, largest financial obligation of the exam for both civil surgeons and for panel physicians. But unfortunately, they are required, and, you know, a vaccine being too expensive isn't a reason to not give it for the exam.
Okay. And it's possible that there are programs available in some states. Since we have participants from around the country, we wouldn't be able to provide state-specific details, but you can reach out to your local health department. There were a few questions that came in about going more electronic with this process. Is it allowed to sign electronically with a stylus?
Hi, so currently, no, we need, USCIS needs an ink signature original from the civil surgeon. As far as electronic submission of the I-693, we are working on that. It's a big priority for us here at USCIS. So we hope to provide kind of updates on that in the future.
Oh, that's great, because that was another question that came in on the chat box.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. There are a few more questions about vaccines. We do have a special session of the webinar series next month, December 15th, that will cover immunizations. But I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple questions because USCIS and CDC won't be on that webinar, so it'd be good to get your perspective on these. For an adult, Hib is not age appropriate, so the not age appropriate waiver box is checked. Does this mean I should check blanket waivers noted should apply, or all vaccination requirements met if they've completed all the age appropriate vaccines?
From CDC, we would say that the vaccinations were complete for if all of the age appropriate vaccines were given or accounted for.
Okay, so they'll check all vaccination requirements met.
Yeah, as far as USCIS's perspective, I think that this is an example of something that we can look at for the next form update because it's a little bit misleading. I think technically if you fill it out, then it would be for the not age appropriate would be like the blanket waiver. However, either way that you complete it, as long as it is, when we review it, we can understand what's happening. And that's something that we'll be looking at to kind of address as it is confusing.
Okay, thanks. A comment came in about when patients bring documentation of prior vaccination, including overseas vaccination. The comment is that sometimes the documentation is maybe questionable validity and there could be missing dates, missing lot numbers for vaccines. It's hard to know whether to trust the documentation. Some applicants present handwritten notes from physicians abroad about vaccination, or they might bring letters from family or friends who are doctors. How do you think civil surgeons should handle that?
Definitely do not accept anything, handwritten letters, anything like that from overseas. You know, there's a lot of fraud that comes with vaccinations. So if anything looks off, you know, dates look potentially change, if dates seem off, for age ranges, if it seems that, you know, someone got, you know, like a combo vaccine and another vaccine of the same type on the same day, it's likely fraudulent. If it doesn't look reliable, then don't accept it. And then just go based on the vaccination technical instructions, that table, whatever is age appropriate at the time of the exam. And I think I saw a few questions about this. You know, they only need one dose of the vaccine that is considered age appropriate to be complete for this exam, so they don't have to complete the whole series. If there is doubt and the applicant would like to have immunity testing done, you know, that's another option. Sometimes, you know, applicants don't want to pay for immunity testing and then vaccines on top of it, so they just choose to get the vaccines. So it, you know, those can be offered as choices, but it's really up to your discretion because you're going to be the person that is looking at the vaccine records. So you're kind of the eyes and ears to identify fraud with that. And if, you know, you're unsure, then just go ahead and vaccinate.
Thank you, that's helpful. Okay, a couple of questions came in about substance use. Nowadays, a lot of people are using marijuana. Is that considered addiction, and should it be documented in the medical conditions? Does it need treatment?
So I'll take that question, and I am going to be giving a mental health webinar later in the series, I think in January. But technically, marijuana is on the controlled substance list for, like, federally for the country. So that would be if there is a substance use disorder, that would be Class A, because it would be treated the same as cocaine. You really need to go by the DSM criteria for substance use disorder or abuse. And we can go into more details of that in the exam or the webinar later on.
Okay, thank you. And here's another one that you might want to get into this in more detail in the webinar on January 21st, but I'm going to put it out there now as food for thought. Has there been any movement towards changing the addiction exclusions to be more in line with current diagnoses of use disorders and not addiction/abuse, which aren't currently used clinically?
Yeah, so the technical instructions use the same classifications as the DSM. So we use the substance use abuse and disorders.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to bring up one more question about expiration of forms. If the applicant's exam is not valid due to signature no earlier than 60 days before the underlying form was filed, does the civil surgeon need to repeat the exam and all the labs since it's invalid? I think Laura or Sam, that might be a good one for you guys. So
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
The form passed its 60-day expiration mark. At that point, does the civil surgeon need to repeat the exam and the labs, since the form would be considered invalid?
Laura, I don't know if you want to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I don't think there's formal guidance for this one, but if the civil surgeon has reason to think that the test results would no longer be relevant, then they might want to retest. But typically, I think, and Laura can speak to this more, but typically it's within the civil surgeon's discretion if they need to retest or if they think the results are still relevant.
Yeah, that's the standard answer that we do give. Again, realizing that we are not an agency that can speak to medical matters. So we ask the civil surgeon to use their best professional judgment, and we also defer to the technical instructions as far as dates for specific exams and testing.
Okay, great, thanks. Olivia, can I turn it back over to you for a few more questions?
Yes, definitely. Okay, so I know we will talk more about vaccinations during the next session, but there are a couple questions. Are current influenza vaccinations during the flu season required for adults between 19 and 49 years old?
Yes, so flu vaccines are required based on the ages listed in the technical instructions. If it's flu season, if it's available in your office, then it's required to give it.
Okay. Okay, great. And a TB question. If an applicant has a documented treatment for LTVI based on a reactive TST, does he or she still need an IGRA for the I-693, or is the documentation of the previous treatment enough?
So if there is documentation of a previous IGRA or no IGRA results in just treatment?
If there's documentation of previous treatment.
I think if there's no documentation of a previous IGRA, then they need to have an IGRA.
Okay. Okay, great, thank you.
So this also applies to people that had positive TSTs. They still need an IGRA. So the only time a previous positive would mean that they didn't need an IGRA is if it was a previous positive IGRA.
Okay. Okay, great, thanks. Another translation question. Can smartphone language apps be used for interpretation?
Yeah, so we don't really have specific guidance on smartphone applications for that. I would say right now, if you, as in your office, feel comfortable as part of your local practice using that for translation, then go ahead. If you truly, in your professional judgment, believe that you can adequately communicate with the civil surgeon. But I'm going to refrain from completely answering that right now. It's kind of one of those things that we have on our list to kind of look at more closely. Okay.
Thanks. Another quick vaccination question. Do applicants need to finish vaccination boosters for the I-693 to be signed off?
So no, only one dose is required for at the time of the exam to be considered complete for the exam, so they do not need to finish an entire series. And basically for vaccines, you should always first go to the table 1 on the vaccination technical instructions to see what is required according to age. And then after you know what is required by age for this specific exam, you go to the ACIP tables to see dosing and spacing and things like that. And if they have previous documentation of vaccination history, you can use the ACIP tables to determine if they are up to date or if they need an additional dose.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we talked about this, but someone's asking for clarification. Can you please clarify if the civil surgeon has to do the labs, or labs are accepted from PCPs if they were done recently?
No, the labs need to be done by the civil surgeon.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and I see another TB question just came in. If someone had treatment previously but no IGRA, and then the IGRA test positive for the civil surgeon exam, is a new x-ray needed even though they had a previous LTVI treatment?
Yes.
A follow-up question, yeah. Great. So Laura, I'll open it back up. I'm looking through our questions. I think a lot of things most things have already been touched on. I see a lot of repeat questions, but I wanted to see if you saw anything new.
Yeah, there's one more that I want to put out there.
Okay.
So one person is reporting a shortage of gonorrhea and chlamydia NAT testing kits, and they wondered if there's any alternative to the NAT urine testing for gonorrhea.
So, you know, this is something that we have been discussing. Really, this just needs to be a NAT test. Currently, the shortage has to do with the Aptima hologic test. And I believe through Quest and from our discussions with the SMEs at CDC there and the company itself, that this is being rectified. So it's really not all tests. It's just a specific test. And we realize that this is a difficult time given how much COVID testing is going on. Sometimes it's not specifically the test component itself. It may be the reagents. It may be, you know, the tubes. There are different things that are getting used by a lot of the labs that are being diverted to COVID testing. And at this time, we are not changing the requirements of the exam because it is designated by the regulations and the laws for immigration.
Okay, thanks. One person asked if we'll be posting a transcript of all the questions and all the answers. We're not planning to do that, but a recording of this session will be available. So if you missed the answer to a question that was asked and you want to listen to it again, feel free to watch the recording. Olivia and I will go through the questions later. Anything that we didn't get a chance to ask and answer this time, we'll save for the January 21st webinar. We're going to have a really long question and answer session with all the panelists from all 3 webinars. So some of these questions will come back again. At this point, maybe we can just open it up to any of the presenters if you have any final comments or clarifications that you wanted to add.
Hi, this is Laura. I just wanted to thank everybody for their attendance today and offer that if you have questions that we didn't get to and you don't necessarily want to wait till January, if they are USCIS related questions, go ahead and shoot us an email at opscivilsurgeons@uscis.dhs.gov. I put it there in the chat and let us know what you need answered and we'll be happy to look at it for you. Thank you.
Yes, and I will go ahead and put, make sure that everyone has CDC's civil surgeon's email in the box in case you missed it. And, you know, and I will say that some of the questions that I read through are in the technical instructions on the website. So definitely take a look closely at the technical instructions because I think some of the questions are answered on the website.
Okay, great. I'll just go ahead and add a couple closing comments as well. So to request CME or CME credits for participating today, you will have to fill out the evaluation that's going to be sent out. You'll receive that via email. I'll be sending that out shortly. So you just complete the evaluation, and then there's a CE request at the end there as well. And as Laura mentioned, we do have 2 more sessions coming up. The next one will be on December 15th, starting at the same time at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. And then there's also a session in January where we'll have more time dedicated for Q&A as well. And during this next session in December, we will talk more about immunizations and STDs as well. Okay. Well, great. I don't have anything else, Laura. I don't know if there's any final things that you want to add in, but.
Nope, but thank you so much for participating, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for getting on. We hope to see you on the next session as well. The session was recorded. We will have the slides available. We can let you know via email once those are available to share. So thank you so much, and please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions.
Thanks, Laura and Olivia.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.